The BBC does a lot of decent journalism on Israel's war against Gaza. In particular, its journalists on the ground in the region produce high-quality reports on the human costs of war. But some of their journalists, and especially those here in London, do not meet that high standard. And one radio host in particular this week put all of her pro-Israel bias on show. On Wednesday, Emma Barnett interviewed the Israeli ambassador, Zippy Hotovely, and gave her an incredibly easy ride. The following day, she interviewed the Lebanese ambassador, and well, the difference could not be more stark. Let's start with Barnett's interview with Zippy Hotovely.
What can you say of the impact and how many missiles got through and were not intercepted?
I think the most important thing to remember that 182 Iranian rockets were targeting Israeli civilians. This is the most important thing because sometimes we are checking whether people got killed or didn't get killed. No, the intentions matter. And the intentions of the Iranian regime was to target Israeli civilians in a massive attack. I don't think Britain would have coped with 182 rockets direct to London, to Manchester, to Birmingham, to your main cities. This is what happened yesterday.
The reason I was asking about the impact is to understand, I suppose, as well, not to take away from the aim, what the impact has been, whether people have been injured, lost their lives, to get a sense of that, as also when you then go on to talk about what your reaction will be.
So what's wrong with this interview so far, right? Well, the Israeli ambassador, a belligerent in the fighting in the Middle East, right? This isn't a neutral arbiter or a neutral speaker, says, as a matter of fact, that the intention of Iran was to target civilians. Now, Emma Barnett could have asked, what evidence is there of that, right? Because the only evidence seems to be that Iran, as well as targeting airfields, targeted one military building in a built-up area. So that was the Mossad in Tel Aviv. Now, of course, that's something that puts civilian lives at risk. But it's nothing compared to the civilian cost when Israel says it's targeting military facilities in Gaza or Lebanon, right? Now, that might have been something which was useful to bring up when you're talking to an Israeli politician. But Emma Barnett doesn't say that. She just accepts the premise. She says, quote, not to take away from the aim of Iran. So she's accepting there the premise from Zippy Hotovely, which isn't evidenced and which is self-serving for an Israeli politician. Let's go back to that interview and let's see if it gets any better.
The Iranians will pay major price for what they did yesterday.
What does that mean?
It means they won't be able to fire again on Israel. It means that in the end of the day, Iran was creating this circle of fire around Israel with its proxies, and we are eliminating the proxies one after the other. We eliminated Hamas, we are eliminating Hezbollah, and we will make sure that Iran won't have capabilities to hurt Israeli people, just like it's been doing for the last 40 years. We're speaking about 40 years of aggression.
Now, Zippy Hotovely there is expressing a desire that would undoubtedly spin the Middle East into all-out war, right? She's expressing a really extreme aim, saying Israel won't rest until Iran doesn't even have the capacity to fire at Israel. Now, the idea that a country shouldn't even have the capacity to make war, that's incredibly extreme. We'd be in a sort of permanent state of war if that's what we expected of any international rivals, that they didn't even have the capacity to strike each other. That's why we normally go for diplomatic solutions. But she's completely rejecting any kind of diplomacy. And that might have been worth challenging, right? A tough interviewer might also have challenged Hotovely's claim that Iran is the biggest source of instability in the region, right? Might Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine have something to do with instability in the Middle East? Well, this was the follow-up from Emma Barnett.
You talked there about the response. The leaders have stood with Israel that you have mentioned very, very clearly, and not least America. But there is also urge for restraint. There is also concern about all-out war in the region. Are you saying that that's what your intention is now?
Our intention is to protect our people. We didn't choose those wars. Those wars were imposed on Israel by Iran and its proxies. And it's Iran that is escalating. It's Iran that is attacking. It's Iran that is firing. We cannot confuse here between the victims and the aggressors. The Iranians are the aggressors. The Israelis are the victims of this attack. And I want to say again, I don't think Britain would have accomplished the idea that rockets coming from a country overseas will be targeting Londoners and people, the Britons in this country. No country would have agreed to that.
And if I was interviewing a British leader in that scenario, I would be asking this question, which I just tried to ask: is there going to be all-out war? Is that the view of the Israeli leadership right now? Is that the goal?
Actually, the opposite. I think when Israel is eliminating those terror proxies of Iran, we are minimizing the problems in the region.
So Israel is minimizing the problems in the region by starting a regional war with Iran, by carrying out what the International Court of Justice thinks could be a genocide in Gaza, right? That was completely insane, what Sipi Hotaveli was saying. And also, I think the thing that I find most pernicious there is Sipi Hotaveli is very clearly, sort of trying to insert an idea in the minds of the audience when she says, what would Britain do if a city like London or Manchester was being bombed, right? She's saying, we are like you. Now, Emma Barnett didn't say, well, what would we do if London was being bombed in the same way that Gaza City was being bombed, right? There was no attempt whatsoever to push back against that completely one-sided narrative that we were getting there. And just the idea that they are doing this to bring peace to the Middle East, right? You had all of the Arab leaders a couple of days ago, we showed you the clip earlier in this week, saying, look, Israel's neighbors don't actually want to make war with Israel. What we want is for them to stop their 50-odd year illegal occupation of Palestinian territories, right? Lots of the Arab countries have actually accepted the existence of Israel. What they want to end is the continued ethnic cleansing in the West Bank and Gaza, right? And Israel won't agree to that. And you could have, as a radio host, brought that up. Maybe the instability is coming from the fact that you're choosing land over peace. But no. And this is how Emma Barnett, in fact, challenges those completely outrageous statements from the Israeli ambassador.
It's just, there will be, those listening to this very concerned about all-out war. I know you talk about the fact that by eliminating these different proxies, these different threats, it will make the region better. But in order to get to that point, if you were to accept what you've just said, there's going to be a lot of lives lost, a lot of carnage, a lot of difficulty.
If you were to accept what you just said, she's clearly accepting it. She's just accepted everything else that Sipi Hotaveli has said in that interview, right? Completely bizarre. We are fighting Iran to make things more peaceful in the Middle East. We're going to war in Lebanon for the benefit of the Lebanese people, right? It's completely bizarre. It's completely topsy-turvy. And Emma Barnett's response is say, okay, yeah, let's accept that. Let's accept that. For the sake of argument, we'll accept that. Isn't it going to be difficult to get there, And what's that doing? That's posing the Israelis as people like us who have a noble aim to bring peace to the Middle East, but there's some sort of difficult trade-offs in how we get from A to B, right? Completely accepting the goal, but saying, aren't you a little bit worried that there could be difficulties when you try and get to what I'm going to accept for the purposes of this interview is a noble aim, right? Now, you might say, okay, maybe this is just an interviewing style. Some people think that you get better answers out of people if you sort of accept lots of their premises, if you're friendly with them, you put them at ease, instead of doing a sort of Jeremy Paxman style, constantly interrupting and trying to catch them out. Maybe Emma Barnett has a particular interviewing style, and she was just demonstrating that there. It was nothing to do with the fact that she seems to have a fair amount of sympathy with the Israeli argument. Well, you could say that if you hadn't listened the following day to Emma Barnett interviewing the Lebanese ambassador. Let's see how that went.
The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, says the UK stands with Israel and recognises its right to self-defence. To remind our listeners, Hezbollah is backed by Iran. Tuesday, we saw nearly 200 ballistic missiles go from Iran into Israel. And we've just heard there 100 rockets are going from Lebanon, from Hezbollah, into Israel. What is your comment of the UK's response to the crisis? Do you see it as commensurate?
Well, the UK has been saying since the early beginning that there should be a ceasefire in Lebanon and that a diplomatic solution should be sought. As for self-defense, I don't see how self-defense goes with posture of occupation. Israel has been in an occupation posture for decades now. So I think the concept of self-defense should be.
Self-defense goes with rockets being fired into its territories and thousands of people not being able to live where they live.
Well, it's clear that Israel has chosen an escalatory path in a very volatile and dangerous region. It opened a Pandora box, and we've said in the beginning that we would want to seek a diplomatic solution, and diplomatic solutions exist. We were on a track trying to discuss a diplomatic alternative to the current Abbas, but the hotheads in Israel chose a different path. I think what we're saying today.
Would you describe Hezbollah as hotheads?
Well, Hezbollah, they have their modus operandi. It's a Lebanese matter. Now they are in a self-defense posture. But I think that the alternative to this exists, which addresses the concerns of everybody. If the real aims of the Israelis is to guarantee the return of their civilian population to northern Israel, we also have our concerns. We can put all these concerns on the table and address them in the framework of this Security Council Resolution 1701 that had worked well from 2006.
Hezbollah have to come to the table, don't they? And I wonder if your government's done enough to condemn Hezbollah and condemn its actions. You say Hezbollah is in a self-defense position. There is not a view of that by many who would view firing rockets and continuing to firing rockets into northern Israel as self-defense. They would view that as attack.
Literally, she's talking to the Lebanese ambassador and she asks him the question that, gets put to student activists, right? Do you condemn Hezbollah? Right? She hasn't listened to anything he's saying. And he's actually right when he was saying that Hezbollah were coming to the table to sign a ceasefire deal, right? We've heard that from all sides now, that actually there was a 21-day ceasefire that was being agreed between Israel, between Hezbollah, between the various allies of both. But Netanyahu walked away from it because he wanted to assassinate Nasrallah instead. And she said, well, will you condemn Hezbollah? Will you condemn Hezbollah? And then she's also putting this sort of imaginary view, which she didn't do to Sipi Hotaveli. She said, well, lots of people would say that firing rockets isn't self-defense. She didn't say to Sipi Hotaveli, well, lots of people think that the fact that you have been illegally occupying some territory for the past 50 or so years, and that you've killed 40,000 people, many of them, or tens of thousands of them, women and children. Many people would say that that means that you're contributing to instability in the Middle East. That sort of imaginary, some people are saying, didn't get brought to the table when it was Sipi Hotaveli. It only gets brought to the table when it's the Lebanese ambassador. And the hectoring went on.
We want a diplomatic solution for this problem, and we still stick to this diplomatic solution. We have a Security Council resolution. We have the framework.
It doesn't matter, does it? If Hezbollah's not coming to the table, a ceasefire required.
They did come to the table
while continuing to fire rockets.
So then she's changed her tune, right? She said they did come to the table, which they did. She said, okay, they did come to, while continuing to fire their rockets. Now, what does she think a ceasefire is? Right? The point of a ceasefire is you're fighting, and you're meeting to have an agreement to stop fighting. Now, the fact that you're firing rockets while negotiating a ceasefire does not mean you don't want a ceasefire, right? And I don't know why she didn't ask that to any of the Israeli guests. This idea, they weren't really looking for a ceasefire if they were still firing rockets. Like, this is really basic stuff. You can't say, they didn't want a ceasefire because they were still fighting a war. You wouldn't need a ceasefire if you'd stopped fighting a war. Right? It is completely bizarre, but she's talking to him like he's kind of an insolent child. And this is how the interview ended.
We're talking about since October the 7th, there has been a continuous barrage
since October the 7th, there has been a genocide.
That is a reality, Rami Mortada. You're Lebanon's ambassador to the UK, and it's about what's happening at the moment. And you say Hezbollah are in a position of self-defense. That is a completely opposite view of those perhaps living in the north of Israel.
That's why we said there is a diplomatic solution that addresses their concerns, but we also have our concerns. On October the 7th, there was a genocide that started in Gaza. Conflicts in the region are contagious because the social fabric is shared by all the countries of the region. We need to stop this carnage in Gaza, stop this carnage in Lebanon, and seek a diplomatic solution. This expansion of the war theater does not help. It's pushing the region towards abyss. It's time to reverse the trend and look for a diplomatic solution. That's what we are saying.
Rami Mortada, we've got to leave it there. Lebanon's ambassador there. Of course, you say a genocide was started on October the 7th. October the 7th was, of course, the day that there was the biggest attack on Jewish lives since the Holocaust. I think it's an important point to put into that particular context. Rami Mortada, Lebanon's ambassador to the UK. Thank you.
So he gets this sort of phony correction at the end of his outro. Right. Thank you for speaking to me. By the way, I'm just going to add something which I think is important, which I think you got very wrong. Oh, bye-bye. Can't respond to that. right? Sipi Hotoveli, the Israeli ambassador, did not get that. Also, the bit that really got me there, she was like, "You are the Lebanese ambassador to the UK." Right? It's so patronizing. Alan, I want to bring you in on this. I was listening to both of those live on Radio 4, and I was just when I was listening to the Zippy Hotoveli one, I was sort of like, God, this is so. She's just really allowing Zippy Hotoveli to put forward all of this Israeli propaganda for 10 minutes without really any challenge. And then listening to the Lebanese ambassador being interviewed the following day, I was like, what the hell is going on?
Yeah, it's remarkable, isn't it? I mean, firstly, on the Zippy Hotoveli interview, she's saying, we've done nothing wrong. It's purely defensive. Israel is in the right. Everybody else is in the wrong. Let's just do a little bit of a roll call of the last 12 months. Israel has illegally invaded Lebanon. I think it's contravened international law in terms of what it's doing. 2,000 Lebanese have died in the last fortnight. It's killed at least 40,000 people in Gaza, maybe more than 100,000. You've had the continuation of illegal settlements in the West Bank. You had the illegal extrajudicial killing of Haniyeh in Iran when he was there to see the inauguration of the new Iranian president. Go further back. Israel illegally developed nuclear weapons in breach of non-proliferation. Israel illegally occupies various parts of the West Bank and obviously Gaza too. It breached a whole ton of UN resolutions going all the way back to 1947, 1948. Illegal, unjust. And then, of course, Emma Barnett's talking about, well, you've got in Lebanon, Hezbollah are firing their rockets. Do you know how many Palestinians are in Lebanon? About 250,000. Not many people know this. Why are they there? They were ethnically cleansed. They haven't got a right of return, again, as is their right under international law, to go back to Palestine, which doesn't even exist. So, this is quite important context, you'd think. But the people who've been ethnically cleansed, who don't have a country even to return to, those are the baddies. The country which has been absolutely destroyed, Lebanon, by obviously huge floods of people going in. It's hard to manage a refugee population of 300,000 people when your population is 4 million in Lebanon. You obviously had that disaster recently, a couple of years ago, with regards to the explosion in Beirut. You've been invaded multiple times by Israel. You only got Israel out in 2006, 2000. You had the war there in the early 1980s. Horrific civilian casualties suffered by the Lebanese. But the Lebanese are the bad guys. The Lebanese are the bad guys. Sorry. Zippy Hotoveli, they're the good guys. The ethnic cleansing, they're the good people. Now, I don't want to talk about good guys and bad guys because actually you have fanatics in all kinds of places around the world. We can all do good or bad things. The state of Israel was founded fundamentally on a desire to ethnically cleanse large numbers of people. However, I don't think that justifies killing civilians as is what happened on October the 7th, of course. But Emma Barnett's choice of words and her inability to provide bigger, broader context for the audience is really key. Is really, really key. And even that point about the biggest number of Jewish deaths since the Holocaust. I mean, this is how no sensible person, Michael, no serious sensible person can compare Hamas to the Third Reich and the Wehrmacht. Arguably the most vicious, effective military machine Europe has ever created. And you're comparing it to people who on average are 19, 20 with little homemade rockets. But of course you have to do that. You have to create that comparison in order to legitimate killing 2,000 Lebanese in 2 weeks, in order to legitimate killing 100,000 people in Gaza, in order to legitimate extrajudicial killings of the political leader of Hamas in Tehran, killing diplomacy staff of Iran and Syria. You could go on infinitely with this stuff. The killing of nuclear scientists in Iran, in Tehran by the Mossad, Stuxnet virus. These are all breaches of international law, but international law doesn't exist for Israel. And of course, in order to create a license for that, an alibi for that, you have to create this idea that somehow Hamas is as dangerous as the Third Reich and the Wehrmacht. And as I've said repeatedly, Iran, which is of course a major regional player, can't lay a glove on Israel. It can disincentivize what it's doing in Lebanon. It can, make the costs very high, but ultimately it can't destroy Israel. Israel has nuclear weapons. Israel has F-35s. Israel has the Mossad. Israel has an open blank check from Washington. It has tens of billions of dollars of aid when it needs it, when it asks for it, okay? But somehow it's represented by people like Emma Barnett. I'm not saying she did it right there, but people in the media class that give that kind of performance as if, Israel is moments away from decimation and destruction. Unless they can kill civilians with impunity, then it won't exist anymore. And you have this strange contradiction with Israeli politics. We want to be a normal country. Israel is meant to be the land of Jewish people. They have a right to self-determination, just like anybody else. We just want to be normal. Well, normal countries don't breach international law 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. They don't go around killing diplomats. And by the way, it's not just, you might say, well, Iranian diplomats in Syria. I don't care. There was a Scandinavian diplomat, a human rights diplomat, who was tasked with trying to solve the problem of Israel-Palestine, Bernadotte something, I can't remember. In 1946-47, he was tasked with trying to sort this out as part of a broader UN mission. He was assassinated because he was trying to create a fair settlement between the Palestinians and the Israelis. He was killed by far-right Zionist militias. Okay? The King David Hotel bombing, 91 people died, I think in 1947, including many British service personnel. Hundreds of British soldiers died. In the Mandate of Palestine, killed by the Irgun, the Lehi, the Stern Gang, far-right Israeli Zionist militias. Hundreds of them. And yet, apparently, those people were fighting for civilization. They were holding back the Muslim hordes. The slightest engagement with the history, with the reality, with a little bit of scholarship, reveals all of this stuff to be complete and utter nonsense, which is why, to borrow a term from Steve Bannon, Israel and broadly the Zionist lobby has to flood the zone with shit. Because if we have a sensible, informed, calm debate, they haven't got a leg to stand on.
Yeah, I think that's all really important points. I suppose the reason that interview got to me so much is just because I've never seen a clearer example of someone sort of interviewing a sort of Western-aligned politician and speaking to them as if they're a legitimate voice, and actually being quite. She deferred to her, essentially saying, okay, I'll accept your premise. I'll accept your premise there, being really, really respectful. And then the moment you're speaking to a politician from a country that's not a Western aligned nation, you're speaking to them like they're some sort of uppity student activist. I thought it was just quite racist, really.